presenters have audio, and so if you have a question, please use the chat box, and I'll monitor that and kind of remind the presenters to look at that when there's a question that comes through. This webinar will be recorded and archived on our website, and the website is listed there in the chat box already. So I'm just going to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Wynn Wright is Associate Professor here at Michigan State University, and Dr. Sandra Hodge is Extension Associate Professor and State Public Policy Specialist at the University of Missouri. And I'll turn it over to Wynn.
Okay, hello. I'm Wynn Wright, as Scott said, and very nice to be with you today. We also have Sandy, who is joining us from Missouri. You can tell the difference between Sandy and I. I'm the one that talks funny, so maybe that will help you. But if you're from the South, maybe I don't talk so funny. But glad you could join us to talk about public talk and public action. The purpose of our webinar today is to introduce you to the ways in which we can work to advance civic capacity, to tackle many of the tough issues that you're exposed to in your work, I'm sure, as extension educators, many of the very difficult, sometimes tense and contentious issues that face our communities. Let me begin by asking a couple of framing questions, and I don't know if you're going to be able to respond to these orally, but you can raise your hand. You can write in a comment in the chat box if you have something you'd like to share. But this work begins or jumps off from the starting point that there are many difficult and contentious issues in which extension educators are forced to work today. So I'm curious, how many of you have been involved, or have you been involved in difficult or contentious public issues in your work? If you want to, Mike has raised his hand. Yay, Mike. So we know Mike McDavid from Penn State has been involved in such issues, as has Abby, Ellen, Monica, Jody, a number of folks. Thank you for sharing that. So I'm starting to see a pattern that maybe there is a need to talk about how these contentious issues affect your work. Next question, do you feel like you've had the knowledge, skills, and tools to effectively fulfill your role as an extension educator in these situations? In other words, were you confident as an educator in working with the public on that particular issue? Again, I see some folks raising their hands. Some folks, I'm assuming this means you were confident. Not always, because my emotions get involved. Thanks for sharing that, Abby, from Minnesota. Other thoughts about how you experienced working with the public around contentious issues before we move on? It seems like some of you have experience with this, others perhaps not so much. What we want to do today is to talk about what's going on, where these contentious issues come from, and ways in which we as extension educators can help communities resolve and address these issues, particularly developing an approach that we're calling public talk and public action through a professional development community of practice via e-extension. Let me begin by saying that it may come as no surprise to many of you that there seems to have been a retreat from public life in the past 50 years or so. Sociologists and political scientists have found that there appears to be growing malaise with public commentary and public affairs. Yeah. Take this slide, for example. Worth 1,000 words. Does it look familiar? It increasingly seems as if public discourse in the 21st century is rife with distrust, skepticism, even sometimes the glorification of others' failures. It seems people are fed up with politics, turned into blood sport, and frustrated that we don't seem to be making progress on lingering social problems like poverty, healthcare, poor housing, failing schools, and these sorts of things. Our radio airwaves are filled with hate radio, and politics is often viewed as political theater or a competition between two opposing forces. A growing number of critics prefer just to sit by the wayside and abandon the public square of citizenship altogether. We know that democracy requires that citizens play an active role, yet we increasingly behave as if voting, pulling the lever at the voting booth every 2 or 4 years, is sufficient to fulfill our public obligation to the communal whole. And I suspect in much of the work that you do within Extension shares some of these same challenges. In many ways, the social dynamics inside the land-grant university system at large can be seen as a microcosm of our larger social world. I know in the work that I do, controversies cut across virtually all domains that take place in the College of Agriculture, such as stem cell research, animal welfare, food safety, new energy sources, biotechnology. People are asking, should we pursue free trade or fair trade? Consumers want to know, should I buy local? Should I buy conventional products? Should I buy organic products? What's the difference? How can my consumption practices do good? Should I prioritize the health of my family in my consumption practices? Or should I think about the planet? What do I think about farm workers, family farmers? The list of challenges goes on, and these are extremely difficult decisions to make, and they're complicated by the entrenchment of stakeholders who interpret any form of change as a loss. Maybe a loss to my pocketbook, my income, a loss to my status, a loss to their power, a loss to even, in some cases, their identity. We live in a time of incredible uncertainty, and many of the questions that are facing Americans can't be answered in conventional ways. Where does all this tension and struggle come from that we're faced with in our work? In a nutshell, it comes from actually the democratization of society. It comes from the new choices, the new opportunities, the new doors that are open to us as we pursue our new interests and desires. And in that process, we develop new worldviews. We develop new ways of seeing the world, if you will. And these new ways of seeing the world, these new worldviews are vast, they're very diverse, and they often put us in conflict with one another, as we all learn to see the world differently and interpret it differently. These differences in worldviews, of course, are informed by what we might think of as our social location. They're informed by our race, our social class, our gender, our sexuality, our spiritual beliefs, but they're also linked to our roles in families, our workplace, as well as the activities we engage in leisure. But keep in mind, just because we all see the world differently does not mean all views are equal. Sometimes reality is not accurate. How many of us have looked in the mirror and seen something totally different than the reality, like this relatively thin guy who thinks he's a bodybuilder? Our realities may be diverse and lead us into competition or conflict with one another, but at the same time, there are realities that are accurate and some that, of course, may be somewhat misguided. As a result of these competing worldviews, sorely needed are approaches that enable public consideration of options, preferred outcomes, that address very timely, complex, and contested issues. We need opportunities to weigh our values and our worldviews, to compare them, discuss them, explore them, and understand them with others, and also to compare those alongside available options. An extension can be a partner in this new work by fostering development and spreading leadership approaches that respond and advance the public good. To bridge the divides that separate people, communities, institutions, that fragment us, that cause rancor, tension, and strife, we first have to understand each other. And a first place to start with that is what we're calling through public talk. And I want to spend a couple of minutes defining what we mean by public talk, why it's important, and how it might be useful for creating the context to encourage public talk in your work. Let me begin by saying when I use the phrase public talk, I'm referring to a form of civic dialogue. This is talk that goes on in a public arena. And of course that might be 2, 4, 50, or 1,000 individuals taking place in the conversation, but it's a form of civic dialogue. It can also be a form of collaborative problem solving, where people come together to weigh options available to them to solve problems that they face as a community. It's a form of a deliberative democracy where people meaningfully engage in conversation and deliberation, weighing options before them to bring about some sort of action or social change that they're facing. It also privileges facilitation rather than teaching, and this one I think is somewhat difficult for some to become comfortable with, simply because it departs in many ways from the conventional knowledge transfer approach that's typified much of extension programming over the course of the 20th century, or certainly the latter part of the 20th century. There's some evidence that this approach was certainly very important, if not central, in the early days of the development of cooperative extension in the United States. But it is a process of creating public knowledge rather than the transmitting of information that the extension has done so well and continues to need to do so in some cases. But let's face it, in many cases, much of the tension and struggle that I suspect you work with in your communities is not so much about the technical aspects of some phenomenon that university land-grant officials or experts are very savvy at communicating, but it's more, many of those tensions are more about how are we going to live our life? What sort of community do we want to live in? What sort of people do we want to be? And how are we going to agree and cooperate together? And in the process of engaging in this sort of public talk, we are creating these trusting relationships so that people can share ideas and values through respectful conversation, and in the process understanding each other's worldviews. I think I got a little carried away there. Sorry about that. Okay, so why is public talk important? We think it's important because, one, it's a way for extension to create new purpose and new value added, if you will. That's very critical at this particular time. Many of extension agencies or extension offices around the country are facing incredible social and economic crises. This is a form of legitimation, as extension is often seen as an unbiased actor who can participate in helping communities solve contested issues and work toward change. This is a critical way to think about positioning extension to provide new value-added work in times of economic and social crisis. It's also a way for extension to respond to the needs of new and a broader range of constituents that may increasingly not see the value in some of the traditional programming that extension has excelled in, such as the programming devoted to 4-H or agricultural constituents, for example, brings in a new range of constituents that might be available to support extension in times of crises. People in communities have needs and issues that often are best addressed through dialogue and deliberation. Again, I mentioned earlier that many of the problems that I suspect you face in your communities have little to do with technical proficiency, but they're larger questions of values, questions that force communities to ask the question of, how do we want to live together? What kind of people do we want to be? What do we believe? What do we value? And how are we going to align our actions in order to make those values a reality? It's also a method for community building and problem solving, for building trusting relationships, for enhancing social capital, that sense of we-ness and reciprocity that's so important for cohesive and functional communities. It's also vital for for a robust democracy. Our democracy depends on our ability to engage in respectful conversations, and as we said at the onset of this presentation, that seems to be in short supply increasingly in many public venues. But it's also, even more important, critical for the future of our society. Societies only function well when competing worldviews are understood, accommodated, and respected. One of the ways that we can learn to engage in public talk is to begin by designing places for people to engage, to talk to each other, to listen to each other meaningfully, not just to share ideas, but to meaningfully engage and hear each other's values as they present them on particular topics of interest. We can also learn to listen with an open mind, cleared of competing thoughts. And I think in many cases where extension educators have undertaken this work, they've reported to us a perspective transformation. Their role as extension educator from that of teacher or expert, someone who has the answers and has simply been trained to impart that knowledge from university experts to citizens, to community members, has been changed, has been transformed significantly. They become better listeners to their constituents, perhaps sometimes more compassionate, guides on the side, if you will, facilitators of change rather than the local expert on a very narrow, limited body of issues. And they also learn new skills of process and design. We're seeing, particularly in our state, folks that are increasingly comfortable with turning over their traditional role as expert and becoming more skilled in process design skills and sharing those with the communities in which they work. Thank you for pointing that out, Scott. Brad is saying, I think this would be powerful for Extension to take the lead to continue promoting this type of communication. Can you say more about that, Brad? I appreciate the support. Can you say, for example, maybe an instance where you might think this could be powerful in your work? How to take the lead? Process design. Oh, okay. Thank you to Mary. By process design, what I'm referring to are opportunities for extension educators to learn to nurture these types of skills. Perhaps it might come in the form of facilitative skills, moderator skills, mediator skills in our state, and I know in a number of other states around the country that I've been exposed to. This has become an increasingly important part of the programming of extension, that maybe it happens at the university level, or sometimes many of our programming in Michigan is happening at the county level, where many of our extension educators in the county are highly trained specialists in creating the context for facilitating these new types of opportunities. We have a program called Facilitators Excellence, for example, where educators across the state are participating to learn how to become a better facilitator and how to get people together so that they can talk and listen to each other's challenges and open their mind to think about how those challenges are rooted in a set of core values. Okay, I hope that helps, Mary. And maybe Brad's still thinking, so if so, we'll move forward. Let me tell you how that some of us are thinking about embedding this work in extension, and that's through the e-extension platform. E-extension has a format called a professional development community of practice that allows us the opportunity to create programming specifically aimed at the professional development needs of extension educators. As many of you probably are well aware, e-extension has historically been aimed at providing the answers to a relatively narrow, important, but a typically technical set of problems that citizens are facing. But there are opportunities within e-extension to develop communities of practice for extension professionals around the country. And we have been approved and are working with e-extension to develop an e-extension network to help extension professionals assist each other in gaining this set of skills, competencies, and experiences so that you can employ this sort of public talk, public action approach as part of your extension portfolio assignment. I'm going to turn back to the chat box because I noticed there are a couple of more comments. First, I see something from John that says, are we certain we're being asked or charged by someone or some decision-making entity to take the lead? I think in our case, if I understand your question, John, what we're seeing in our states is that increasingly citizens are asking extension educators to take these sorts of responsibilities because they're perceived to be, in many cases, a neutral body within their community. Perhaps you've got challenges like I mentioned earlier, or perhaps there could be a host of other challenges that you're facing in your community, and often extension is that go-to body that's perceived as being a way to bridge the divides in a community that might have entrenched stakeholders, fragmented them, pulled them apart. I'm thinking about many of the land use conflicts, natural resources conflicts, particularly in a state like Michigan that we particularly face that can be very difficult. Brad's also noted in his comment that I think that in this time of political rancor raising to a fever pitch, our citizens need to be able to see extension can help facilitate this type of process. Many folks are still not aware of the role or even the presence of extension. We are doing our best to frame our overall frame of building public value. Thank you, Brad. Yes, I would agree. And not only are, I think we've been asked in communities, as I said earlier, I think that this is a pivotal way, particularly when so many people don't know who extension are. If that's the case in your state, I can't attest to, but I would agree with Brad. Certainly in my state, it's certainly much more likely that most citizens have never heard of extension, even after all of these decades of fine service to communities across the country. So how do we make our public value resonate with this particular audience, particularly in times of economic strife, is critical. Being seen as this neutral party that can help reduce some of these tensions is really critical, I think, at this particular time. And strengthening extension's capacity to use public dialogue and deliberation and related action strategies to bring about some sort of solution or resolution to public problems can help reduce not only the tension but move communities toward a more prosperous and sustainable future. I'm going to stop here because I'm going to let Sandy come in and engage you a little bit. I'm hoping. Yeah, okay.
Yay. Hello, everybody. Let me take George's question first. I think we have to seriously examine our hiring practices. We need to look for skill sets and experiences that advances learning, not necessarily teaching or providing information or knowledge. Um, I think that's an interesting point. One of the things that I think this this e-extension website can do, and that for those of you folks who engage in this citizen-centered approach to whatever kind of engagement for resolving difficult public issues, this public action, I think a lot of it gets back to how can we, as an extension educator, build the capacity of people in our community so they are engaging in it, so they are doing it. Clearly, I work in Missouri, and there's a number of us trained, but we're spread throughout the state. I can't do every community conflict that arises, although there are requests for me to come and facilitate them or moderate them or whatever. So what's interesting to me, though, about the hiring is that I did a workshop on deliberative dialogue for difficult public issues, and I had a range of extension faculty from livestock specialists to community development to folks who were in the fiscal aspects like accounting or financial work in the community. So a lot of people are very interested in developing this skill set. So what I'd like to ask you is if you could just show your hands, raise your hands. How many of you actually have done some really difficult public work on really difficult public issues? Some of the things I mentioned: deliberative dialogue, specifically study circles, collaborative decision making, visioning, conflict resolution. Okay. Adaptive leadership from Abby. Okay. Feel free to put in the chat, because the next question is going to be really important, and what you think about here is what are you doing and what have you done. And okay. So I want to move to the next question and ask you, what more do you need? I mean, what areas are you interested in? Because that's really going to drive the development of the e-extension website. And that's not to say that ultimately we're only going to be doing everything online, because I think this could morph into areas where folks get together regionally perhaps and do workshops together. But initially it will be an online process. So what, in all the areas you mentioned, study circles, collaborative design, visioning, deliberative dialogue, what do you need? What would you like to know? Let's see, we have Abby, John, George, Jody, Brad, and Kristen's hands raised. Are they just saying you've engaged in it, or you want to know something? Okay, Jody, we focus on facilitating engagement and other topics. Okay. Brad, you'd like to learn about deliberative dialogue and study circles. Where are you located, Brad? LSU, okay. How to craft options for deliberative dialogue in public policy forums. Ellen, where are you? Jody, you're interested. Vermont, okay. Well, I do want to tell you too that I just am completing one ISE on that very issue about what is deliberative dialogue, and we had 27 participants, 4 from outside of, 4 states involved, so that's another possibility that could be done. Penn State, John, are you all primarily interested in deliberative dialogue or convening, or what aspects? Because we're really trying to build this website so it meets your interest and needs. Study circles and mediation, okay. Well, Monica, what more would you like to know if you're working in these areas already? What is it that you find is challenging that we could help you with, or this extension website could help you with? Let's see. Jody is interested in building capacity, self and others, in framing issues. Oh, that's a big one. Community issue framing, yeah. How about a webinar series on that topics? Great idea. Brad, you'd also like to learn about mediation. Let me just make a quick note about mediation. you all are gonna, if you're interested in mediation, go online and see if there's a community mediation network in your state, because they often do local training on mediation that you could take advantage of too. View case studies that illustrate how colleagues are dealing with contentious issues. That's interesting. How to use storytelling, okay? Case studies for different sized rural communities, different topic areas, more people having skill sets. So yeah, so it's not concentrated in so few people. I think that what's really going to begin to make a difference in our communities is when people have participated in, when people in our communities, decision makers, have participated in face-to-face trainings, and they can no longer look across the room without thinking about that person as a community member, and maybe they need to move from sort of having more a positional-based approach of me to a more public context of decision-making. In we're looking at community decision-making. Yes, people building their own facilities to building their capability of issue framing. Yes, George, I think we all face that. Put resources, of course the problem we face is that a lot of these public issues and public policy problems don't have immediate impacts, and some of my reports want immediate impacts. Brad, I don't know who does that in your state, but I know that there are community mediation networks in many states. If you just look up in your state community mediation, you might find that it's a state. For instance, I came from Virginia to Missouri, and we have community mediation centers all over Virginia, and they offer local training in conflict resolution. So it's community mediation network. Okay, so this is a great list. Scott, will this list capture with the recording of this? Scott or Wynn? Okay, well, I'll ask them that later. I'd like to catch this list.
Sandy?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, it'll be captured in our final recording.
Okay, it's a great list. Thank you, everybody. Okay, let's go to the next question. So what would be most valuable, excuse me, what would be most valuable to you if you were going to use such a website on citizen-centered approaches to engagement? Thank you, Monica. That's great. That's another resource, is study circles. For me, personally, moving to much more online stuff has been challenging because I like this doing deliberative dialogue work here. I really like the face-to-face interaction. So it would be helpful if you can tell us what is it that you would like to see on the website that would help you to engage on this website. Evaluation strategies, yes. Okay, evaluation strategies. All right, well, let me share an idea. What we were thinking of, sort of an algorithmic thing. If you have this problem, then you could do this and this and this. So it gives you options and kind of leads you in a direction of different approaches for different problems. You cannot use, for instance, deliberative dialogue for every type of problem. It won't work until the problem's actually been framed well enough. Train the trainers curriculum. Train the trainers, yes, okay. Thank you, Monica. Any other ideas what you'd like to see on this website? Tools and approaches for understanding what might motivate stakeholders and participants, and how as a facilitator you can move participants beyond their own identified interests. Yes. Oh, pods for sharing successes and challenges. That's great. Thank you, Jody. So it sounds like that's an option for making it a little more interactive rather than um, just going to the website and reading information. Let me add though that one of the areas on the website will be resources for both beginning and advanced practitioners in different areas. Oh, great, Brad. We're thinking alike. Maybe articles, training manuals, things of this nature. We hope to get a lot of that uploaded. Would there be a possibility for a question and answer session? That's a possibility, yeah. I think maybe even, you know, sort of a program where you might be able to call people if you have a question. Because there's a whole list of people that, as you can see, as you will see on the last slide, that are involved in this. We tried to get representatives from all regions in the U.S. Okay, continue to, you know, share ideas, and also my my email address and Wynn's email address are on the last slides, and I'd love to hear from you. So this is where you will be able to join. We are in the process of developing this. Wynn, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, please join. First off, there's the website where you can go to become a member. Um, but I guess I would add that it sounds like some of you have some experience and expertise that you can contribute, and we're certainly interested in growing our community so that we take advantage. I know that there are pockets, there's not well known, but there are pockets of this work around the country that we really want to tap into to make this a genuine national community of scholars.
I think the other thing that's come up for me by doing this webinar, of how many of you are out there that maybe we could have another interactive webinar on maybe more specific questions, maybe framing or something. I think you all suggested that because it sounds like there's a lot of expertise and a lot of questions out there. And many of you, I don't know where you're from. In fact, I would appreciate it if you take my website, my email address down and email me at the end of this presentation about where you're from and interest in maybe participating in another webinar, maybe more of a training webinar. That might be something we could set up. Okay, so here's your coordinating team. A lot of these folks are working on developing the website and would welcome any participation from you all, any thoughts and ideas.
I think this also is a good group of people from around the country that you might access if you may know one of these folks, or they at least may be in your region. You're certainly welcome to contact Sandy and I, but these are also available to you to reach out to for some mentoring if you like.
And Brad, in response to your question, I don't really know if there's any entity that certifies community facilitation skills. Okay, thank you, Brad. But as I said, if you have more ideas, you can get in touch with these folks on the coordinating team, or please send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to know where you're all from. Just jot me one quickly today, and Wynn also, her address is there. And we'll see what we can put together for you. This is really great participation. I appreciate you all taking the time today, and I know it's a big issue for everybody, so I'm happy to answer any questions or even chat with you by phone once you send me an email with who you are and where you are. Wynn, do you want to do the, or Scott?
Yes, thank you, Sandy. Before we
evaluation?
Yes, before we hang up, let me just draw attention to the summary evaluation that's on the sheet right now. Please take a minute to check the box, yes or no. Well, if you check, that means yes, and it's very valuable for us to get feedback on how we can improve our work and be more accountable and responsive to your needs. So take a minute before you hang up, and again, thanks so much, everyone.
Oh, Brad wants to know when the list will be archived and how to access it. That's a good question. Yes, we could, Abby. Except I can't move that evaluation box. When can you or Scott move that box to the side so Abby can see the address? Great, thank you.
Brad
Thank you, Abby.
has asked
Go ahead.
when the presentation will be archived. It will be available tomorrow, so you can go to the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development website, as Scott mentioned at the beginning, and find the archived version if you'd like to take a look at it again. Under webinars, look under webinars. George has got a question too. Now that we seem to be moving to web-based learning, what challenges do you envision for deliberative processes like this? Well, it's a really, really important question, George. And I think that we all know that the website is a valuable tool, but at the same time, developing collaborative learning, engaging in deliberative dialogue is a innately social practice. So I do think that there's still a lot of room for face-to-face, as Sandy mentioned, face-to-face interaction. And we continue to have to work hard to find ways to not only develop trainings that are face-to-face, but also opportunities for working with communities on these contentious issues that are certainly face-to-face. But we see the web as a jumping off point, at least a place to begin to create a community.
Yeah, I also think that one of the things we can do as a collective is begin to bring up suggestions about how we might build in the face-to-face component. I did an ISE, as I said, with difficult public issues. I had a series of 5 1.5-hour presentations, and one of them was face-to-face in Columbia, and we had people fly in. It was just a 1 or 2 day fly-in, but we had people from New York and I forget where else. So I think that collaboratively we might be able to come up with ideas about how we manage the face-to-face. Maybe Lori can broadcast the link when.
Actually, John's asked for the link, and Scott's typing it in right now. So you can go to the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development website right there and find the archived version. Well, thanks to everyone, and I hope to see you